So Plato and Aristotle are two of the biggest, most important philosophers in history, and there's so much we could talk about for either of them. In this lecture, all we're really going to talk about are a few things that they said about how to do ethical theory. You might remember the first video lecture, I was saying, well, why should we bother reasoning about ethics? Why should we do all this critical reflection and asking for justifications? And I gave you what I think. We're going to look at sort of what they think. What's the point, and how will we know if we've made it? How will we know we've got a good ethical theory? This is supposed to help us starting next week when we look at specific ethical theories. This will help you keep in mind what's the point? How will we know if these theories have done a good job? What can we reasonably expect from them? Um, Starting with Plato, I gave you a short excerpt from his dialogue, the Meno, which is a fun dialogue. Socrates is kind of the main character. Socrates probably is saying something like what Plato actually believed um, at the time that he wrote it. Um, and the shift in this dialogue goes from, well, can virtue be taught? That's kind of the main point. But then they ask, well, why should we care if it can be? Why is it so important to know what the right thing to do is? Why not just happen to have true beliefs? Why not just go through life and as long as you sort of do what you've been taught, there's a chance that you're already doing the right thing. Why not do that? Why seek knowledge? Why dig for all these reasons and stuff? What's the point? And the answer that Socrates gives is something like this. Well, if you have true beliefs about what's right and wrong, but you don't know, that means you just sort of happen to be right about what to do, right? You're going along, you're like, oh, here's a situation where I could lie. Well, I was always taught not to, so I won't. So you don't lie. And turns out it was the right thing to do. But if you have knowledge about what the right thing to do is, then you have a reason, you have a justification or an explanation or something like that on why it's the right thing to do. And the key is that you have an explanation. I think in the text it says you have a cause, but it gives you the little Greek word etion, which is the word more for like explanation or support, something like that, for your belief. So why is that so great? Why is that important? Well, Socrates thinks if you've got that explanation why this is the right thing to do, then it's more reliable. It's a better guide to life. You don't just know, oh, I should do this. You know why you should do it. So you can think about it. You can reason about when it applies and when it doesn't. Stuff like that. So for instance, if you found yourself in a new situation, right? If you were hanging out with your friend at your house, someone pounded on the door, you came up, answered the door, someone said, hey, your friend owes me money. Is he here? I'm going to beat him up. You might be like, well, shoot, I haven't had to deal with this before. And I was just in this situation where I thought I shouldn't lie, and it was the right thing to do. So maybe I shouldn't lie here? Because I shouldn't lie. And after all, if my friend owes this guy money, I'd be mad too. But then on the other hand, he's my friend, and I'm kind of supposed to be loyal to him, and I don't want him to get hurt, right? So you're in a new situation, you've got to sort of reason through these things. And if you've got knowledge about the right thing to do, if you have an explanation, a reason for why something is right and why it's wrong, you're going to be able to sort through all those new confusing things. If you don't, if you just have true belief, it's not going to stick with you. It's not going to be a reliable guide in new situations. So he compares it to this, maybe a myth. In ancient Greece, they really liked what they called automata, robots basically, mechanical contraptions that could do things mechanical contraptions usually couldn't. And apparently there were these really impressive ones called the statues of Daedalus, named after a famous mythic inventor. So there were these statues that could move around like real people. And Socrates says, "Well, have you ever seen those?" And I was like, "No." Socrates is like, "Well, if you've ever seen them, the trouble with them is they don't stay put, you know? They can move around on their own, they could walk away. So if you want to keep it in place while it's doing its little robot walk, you've got to like tie it down with something. You've got to put like a little leash on it, right?" And then I was like, okay. Socrates is saying that's what true belief is like. True belief is great, but if it's not connected to you by some kind of leash, by some kind of rationale, some kind of justification, then it's not going to stick by you in weird situations or when something new comes up that you haven't had to deal with, right? So for Plato, that's the reason you should strive for knowledge about right and wrong, not just sort of go with what you've been taught or hope that you get it right. So that's Plato. That's the main point for Plato. Um, Aristotle, so it's kind of fun. There's like an order of succession. Socrates was a real person, lived in Athens. He just kind of wandered around asking people questions. Um, and he inspired Plato, who opened the first school in Europe, pretty much, like 2,400 years ago. Um, and a student at that school was Aristotle. And he was like the star student. He challenged Plato on a lot of stuff. They went back and forth, but they were good friends. And eventually Aristotle left and founded his own school, had his own theory and stuff. So Aristotle's question in your reading is, how will we know if we've got a good ethical theory? How will we know if it succeeds? When can we say, well, we did a good job, let's call it a day with our ethical theory? And Aristotle says, well, the most you can hope for is sort of a generality. You can hope to say something that's true only for the most part, but not something that's always true, not something that applies universally. Why does he think that? Well, he thinks that morality, like deciding what to do, deciding how to live, what's right and wrong, that kind of stuff only makes sense in a social setting. It only makes sense if you live in a society with other people. If it's just you, if you're the only person in the world, you can just do whatever you want, right? You're not going to hurt anybody else. You're not going to lie or cheat or steal or maim, right? There's nobody to do anything bad to, nobody to help either. So it's not like you have obligations to help people. So that morality is only in a social setting. But the thing about social settings is they're really complex, right? And they're always changing. You're always moving from one to the other, and then there's a bunch more complex factors that weren't there before that you have to think about. I mean, you think about the kind of stuff you had to do that was right or wrong, like in middle school, and then the kind of stuff you had to do that was right or wrong in high school. And now you're out of high school and you're in college. It's totally different, right? Um, Aristotle would say, yeah, there's all these complex factors. There's your grades, your friends, your job, your ambitions. There's stuff you just do for yourself. You've got to figure out how all that balances together with all these different things, like how to be honest, how to be brave, how to be kind. Um, so you're never going to boil everything down to an absolute rule that always fits. What you're going to do is you're going to have sort of a bunch of sort of templates that kind of fit over a bunch of situations. And then you take into account the ways that the specific situation might be different, right? So you just have a bunch of generalities. He has this great line where he says, well, you can't expect sort of the same exactitude from ethics that you can from geometry, right? Geometry, you can start with an axiom, you can use a bunch of inference rules, you can get a conclusion, solid, always true, always applies. Can't do that in ethics, right? Because of how complex it is. But notice, Aristotle is still reasoning. He's still doing philosophy. He's still doing critical reflection. He's just bringing these concepts to bear in a very specific way. if anything, you might think, well, since ethics is so complex and always changing, if anything, we should think even harder about it. We should want even better reasoning than about something that's more cut and dried, like geometry, right? You can just kind of sit down, if you're good at geometry and you know the rules and stuff, you can kind of just sit down and bust out a bunch of proofs. Eventually, you don't even have to think about it. Can't do that with ethics. You kind of have to always be thinking about it, reasoning, trying to come up with good philosophical answers, right? So that's the Plato and Aristotle that you're reading, kind of the main takeaways. Plato thinks that knowledge is better than just happening to have a true opinion about something because knowledge is more reliable, it's going to stick by you, it gives you an explanation why something is the case, right? And Aristotle thinks, well, that's true, and keep in mind how complex it is, and don't expect sort of a quick, easy answer that's going to fix all these questions, right? You've got to sort of keep reasoning in generalities, and then you've also got to think about the specifics of each situation. So that's Plato and Aristotle for this week. Next week, we're going to start on the specific ethical theories. We're going to start with utilitarianism. It'll be a really good time. We'll get into more specifics about specific right and wrong things too.